Hey guys, long time no see. Welcome to Solo ReacTalk. Yes, I've been gone for some time because I've had a swelling allergic reaction to a bee sting on my face. So yeah, it's good to be back. It's good to be back on YouTube. It's good to be back reacting to some videos that have been requested by people. And well done to the Springboks. Oh yes, that was my South African flag. Yes. Well done to the Springboks for winning the Rugby World Cup. Well done, well done, well done, well done. Yes, today or this morning I've been requested to react to a video called Alan Wake, full story and explained lore explained, or extended, sorry, extended lore explained by the YouTube channel Hidden Machine. It's been requested by JP Spectrum 8. JP Spectrum 8 requested this for Halloween last month, but I couldn't because I had the bee sting. So, yes, sorry, it's coming in late, JP, but I'm here now, and let's start with this video. I don't know about this Alan Wake. It's a game, right? Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about it. I have never heard of it before. So it's going to be a first time for me to, watch something about Alan Wake. And yeah, let's start. 3, 2, 1, go.
Hello, Matt from Hidden Machine here once again to dive into the depths of Cauldron Lake.
Hold on. Matt, right? Okay, let me just write it down here.
If you're getting ready to play Alan Wake 2 and you want to get caught up on the Alan Wake story so far, this is the video for you. The basic premise is that 13 years ago, a writer went missing, and there are a lot of mysteries and unanswered questions and strange occurrences surrounding that disappearance. We'll be covering the entire story of Alan Wake all the way up to the events of Alan Wake 2. That means we'll be talking about the Bright Falls web series, Alan Wake the game, Alan Wake's American Nightmare, some of the books regarding Alan Wake, and parts of the game Control.
Wow, this game has got a lot of content, centered around it. But I've never heard of the game, Alan Wake. I've never heard of it. Yeah, interesting. TV shows or web series, books, games.
However, we're not going to just be going in a straight line, recapping each piece of media. Instead, I hope to kind of pull everything that I know about Alan Wake from playing the game and reading all these books and everything, and kind of putting it all together in a form that I think is a lot more digestible than just getting each piece, spread out over the course of the past 13 years. I won't be discussing games like Quantum Break or Max Payne because those games don't share a direct continuity with Alan Wake. But if you do want a video that covers all of the Remedy games, or almost all of the Remedy games, and how they're all connected, well, we've got you covered with the Exploring the Remedy Connected Universe video. So you can check that one out as well, but if you're focused on playing Alan Wake 2, stick around here. It should go without saying that a video like this is going to be full of spoilers. I'm gonna cover what I think are the most crucial parts of the story, but I also think that a video like this could never be a replacement for actually playing the games. There's so many little details and just awesome sequences that you really gotta experience firsthand to fully appreciate. However, in the case that you just want to get caught up on the lore and get a recap of everything that's happened so far, this video is, like I said, for you. If you find this video useful or entertaining, go ahead and leave us a like and consider subscribing to Hidden Machine. We've got a huge backlog of videos covering all the Remedy games, as well as plenty of other games. And if you're in a position to help the channel grow, we've got a Patreon and channel memberships. So check those out if you want, and without further ado, let's get into it. Bright Falls is a 6-episode web series that is the prequel to Alan Wake. The series opens with an unidentified diver pulling a body bag out of a lake. The diver lays the bag on the shore and unzips it, revealing another unidentified individual inside. The diver then gets into a rowboat and leaves the body bag behind. When the camera returns to the body bag, we discover that the person in it has disappeared.
Okay. This is odd. Alright, so why would the diver pick a body out of the lake or wherever that place is and then put it on, on the ground for it to be exposed, and then the body inside the body bag gets out of the body bag? Okay.
This scene really sets the tone for the web series. The show is a rather dark and mysterious look at the idyllic small town of Bright Falls, Washington, where the show and most of the Alan Wake story take place. This is also the type of mystery that we'll encounter many times throughout this video. Every time you hear this sound, we'll tack another mystery up on the board. Now, we'll revisit all of these at the end of the video, but go ahead and feel free to keep notes and try to keep track of things to see what you can figure out on your own in the meantime. Right.
So, from as far as I can tell, we're not dealing with extraterrestrial life, invading this place. What is it, Bright Falls or something? We're not dealing with extraterrestrial life. So we'll probably be dealing with something that is centered around supernatural kind of stuff. Undead creatures, probably magic. Okay. All right.
Falls, the show, focuses on a journalist named Jake Fisher, who travels to Bright Falls to interview Dr. Emil Hartman. Dr. Hartman was a psychiatrist who was
Hold on. Too fast for me. Just right here, Dr. Emil Hartman, psychiatrist, journalist, Jake Fisher. Okay.
promoting a book that he wrote called The Creator's Dilemma. Hartman's practice was focused on artists, and he ran a clinic called the Cauldron Lake Lodge, where artists would stay and be both counseled and monitored by Hartman. While the entire text of The Creator's Dilemma isn't available to us, we do have access to several excerpts, thanks to a book called The Alan Wake Files, which we'll be referring to throughout this video. The book is a physical book that came with the special edition of the first Alan Wake game, and it's included as a PDF with copies of the PC release of the original version of the game. However, it's not a traditional lore guide like you might find with some other games. Instead, the book is presented as if it were written by a character from the game, named Clay Stewart. We'll get into his story a bit later, but essentially, after the disappearance of Alan Wake, Clay traveled to Bright Falls to investigate the situation, and his findings were collected and published as the Alan Wake Files. Through that book, we learn that Hartman began his career as a psychotherapist working in the state of Vermont. He felt limited by his work, stating that the standard procedures he was utilizing never really helped people to fully conquer their psychological challenges. Over time, he moved out west and eventually opened up his own private practice at the Cauldron Lake Lodge. It was there that he developed two trademark methods called engagement therapy and the flow. It was through the use of these methods that he claimed to attempt to help troubled artists overcome the creator's dilemma, which is basically a form of creative blockage occurring when some internal conflict in an artist causes that pure spark of creativity and inspiration to be extinguished. The book reads like a long-form advertisement for the lodge, and although it was marketed towards a mass audience as a sort of self-help guide, the book also insists that the only way one can truly benefit from the methods within is to become a guest at the lodge. When Jake Fisher drives into Bright Falls, he first stops.
This place is not idyllic. It is dark. Okay, it's a dark, forested area. Yeah, it looks like it's haunted, or it's, like some sort of like a supernatural, scary place. Yeah. This place is not idyllic.
at the Oh Dear Diner for a bite to eat. The show indicates that Jake Fisher is a troubled man. He seems to be avoiding his significant other, not even telling them about his trip to Bright Falls before leaving. And he appears to be self-medicating to cope with the stress that he's experiencing. Perhaps Jake hoped that his trip to Bright Falls would alleviate his situation, but he soon finds the town to be a bizarre, although not entirely unwelcoming, place. At the diner, Jake is greeted by a waitress named Rose Marigold, who quickly identifies herself as a big fan of writers, especially Alan Wake. Before he can even put in an order, Jake is presented with a large plate of food and a birthday cake, accompanied by the entire diner singing happy birthday to him.
I won't say no to free cake, but this is weird. This is weird. This town of Bright Falls is not really giving me any indication that it's a normal, boring, idyllic town. No. They don't just give you free food. They don't just give you free cake. Nah, there's something going on here.
Jake departs for a local motel, but on the way there, he strikes a deer with his car. Jake shines a light onto the deer, and the deer cries out in pain. Well, it's easy to assume that the cries of the deer are in response to having been hit by a vehicle. It's much more likely that the deer is responding to having had the light shone on it, and we'll get into why that is a bit later. Jake's light goes out, and as he fumbles with it, the deer appears to run off into the woods. Shaken, Jake eventually arrives at the motel, where things are no less odd. He has another strange encounter, this time with the motel's owner. Before he knows it, a new day has begun, and it's time to meet Dr. Emil Hartman. During the interview with Hartman, Jake becomes distracted by a photo on the wall. We then see a series of strange images, and when we return to Jake, we can see that the interview is over. Jake has little to no memory of what happened, but he has a notepad full of increasingly bizarre writings.
Did Dr. Emil Hartman do something to you? Did it probably put you into some sort of like a trance? And now you just woken up from that trance and you don't know what happened during that time. You just find your book note filled with information. Maybe Dr. Hartman was, practicing his, what is it called again? Creator's dilemma procedure on you somehow. Yeah. Whether it's engagement or flow therapy. Yeah, I'm not sure which one, but okay.
Over the next several episodes, Jake continues to have bouts of memory loss, resulting in extended periods of lost time. He wakes up in strange places, and there's evidence to suggest that he had become violent toward others. Jake had a friend in Bright Falls named Ellen, a woman from his past who had moved to Bright Falls a number of years prior. Having become increasingly panicked and feeling as if he had lost control of his mind and body, Jake attempted to enlist the help of Ellen to drive him out of Bright Falls. But another sudden gap of lost time suggests that he may have killed her. As this dawns on him, Jake realizes that he's driving right back into Bright Falls. He swerves, hits his head on the steering wheel, and hours pass before Jake disappears from the car. This is the last time that we'll see Jake Fisher, but we'll discuss his affliction in more depth a bit later.
Okay, so maybe it's not Dr. Emil Hartman's doing. Maybe he didn't cause some sort of like hypnosis trap on him or something. Okay. So maybe it's something to deal with this town. Some sort of supernatural influence. Okay. But, the moment he woke up in that forest and he saw that he had blood on his hands, he should have took himself to the police, and tell them, guys, I did something. I don't know what did I do. I was, not myself. I did something, I probably killed someone. Can you please take this blood for evidence so that we can find whoever this blood belongs to? You know, maybe that person is still alive, maybe that person is dead, but at least I am availing myself to the police. He didn't do that. Instead, he's washing his hands clean, and then he goes, meets up with his friend, and acts as if everything is normal, everything is okay. And then he decides to leave the town, and then he kills her too. Oh gosh.
As the series ends, we see Alan Wake and his wife Alice driving into Bright Falls on that same road.
This town is cursed. It's cursed. Bright Falls is cursed. And it's not idyllic. This place is scary. I mean, I like dark forests, right? But no, not this place.
This brings us to the story of Alan Wake. It is September 2010. Alan Wake is an accomplished writer who has a background in pulp novels and some television writing credits. Alan contributed scripts to an anthology program called Night Springs, which is similar to shows like The Twilight Zone or Black Mirror. He is most well known for a series of novels starring the hard-boiled detective Alex Casey. 2 years prior, in 2008, Alan released the final Alex Casey novel, titled The Sudden Stop, in which he killed off the character, as Alan wanted to break free from the cycle he had been in and create something new instead. However, Alan was experiencing what Dr. Emil Hartman would have called the creator's dilemma. Alan was unable to write, and he was caught up in a cycle of alcohol abuse, spats with his wife, and run-ins with the law. Alan's career was being managed by his longtime friend, Barry Wheeler, who had a strained relationship with Alice Wake. Despite this, both Alice and Barry were eager to see Alan get back to work. Seeking a solution to Alan's writer's block, Alice came into a copy of The Creator's Dilemma. Alice is an artist herself, a photographer, and she often helped Alan with things like promotional shots for his books. She engaged in a series of informal sessions with Dr. Hartman over the phone. She expressed her concern for Alan, but she also divulged some very personal details regarding some of the relationship troubles that her and Alan had been experiencing. After an invitation from Dr. Hartman, Alice decided to arrange a trip for the couple to Bright Falls, hoping that meeting with Dr. Hartman could help Alan overcome his troubles. However, she did all of this without Alan's knowledge, choosing to disguise the trip as a peaceful getaway rather than an intervention. The couple was slated to rent a cabin in Bright Falls from a local mechanic named Carl Stuckey. However, it wouldn't be long before the same mysterious force that was afflicting Jake Fisher would interrupt their plans. The Alan Wake Files offers us a glimpse into the strange history of Bright Falls. Rumors and recorded claims of paranormal activity in the area go as far back as the 1850s, before Washington even became a state. There have been reports of Bigfoot sightings, strange lights in the sky, and a variety of people, animals, and objects that appeared to be cloaked in shadows, as if they had a sort of cloud of darkness surrounding them. Out of all these strange happenings, one of the most important to our story occurred in 1970. It was around this time that Dr. Emil Hartman was living in Bright Falls and working as a writing assistant for a poet named Thomas Zane. While Thomas Zane's background is shrouded in mystery, from what we can piece together, it appears that he was an auteur filmmaker in Europe who, in the late 60s, moved to the US to pursue poetry. Zane was an avid diver, and he spent a lot of time on Cauldron Lake in Bright Falls. In the center of that lake was a small island called Diver's Isle, and that island was home to a cabin called the Bird Leg Cabin, and the name came from the fact that the island had the shape of a bird's foot. Thomas Zane stayed in this cabin, and he drew great inspiration from his time there. he would regularly explore the depths of Cauldron Lake, often accompanied by his girlfriend, Barbara Jagger. It was through those expeditions that Thomas Zane began to learn that the waters of Cauldron Lake hold many mysteries, and those mysteries became a thing of great interest to the poet and his assistant. You see, Cauldron Lake is what's known as a place of power, and in the Remedy universe, places of power are places that are imbued with supernatural energy. In the case of Cauldron Lake, that energy has the power to turn dreams and art into reality. Through his...
Interesting. Okay. It can bring things into reality, dreams and anything that you write. Okay. I'm still trying to connect this with Jake Fisher. Whatever Jake Fisher was writing in his notebook, did it become reality? I'm just wondering about that. And this entire town, like, do the people there know or understand that they're in a supernatural, paranormal town, or they're living in a place where this magic or this, force exists? Or are they oblivious to what's going on in this town? I'm just wondering about that. Because it's weird what happened with Jake Fisher. The entire town, or not the entire town, but the diner that he was eating at, they gave him free food. They gave him a cake. They were probably singing to him happy birthday. I don't know if it was his birthday, but, it was a very weird encounter with the people at the diner. So I'm just wondering, are those people also being influenced by some sort of supernatural entity? Or are they just like that? Or are they just crazy like that? I don't know. But yeah, this town is weird. And let's continue. Let's see what happens with Alan Wake.
Poetry, Thomas Zane and Emil Hartman experimented with the powers of the lake, discovering that Zane's writing could bend or alter reality. But they also discovered that there was something else in those waters, something much more strange and alien than anything else in Bright Falls.
And the area of effect of this bending or altering reality, how far does it go? Is it only centered in the town of Bright Falls, or around the lake, or on Diver's Alley or Diver's Isle? I'm just wondering about that. What's the area of effect of this supernatural activity?
Earlier, I mentioned that there was record of reports of people, animals, and objects appearing to be cloaked or enveloped in shadow. These shadowy entities are affected by something called the Dark Presence, which is an alien force that resides in another dimension called the Dark Place. The Dark Presence is an entity that doesn't operate on human logic, and its origins and motivations and even physical appearance are still unknown to most people. Beneath the waters of Cauldron Lake lies a portal to that other dimension, the Dark Place, and that portal is called a threshold. Now, thresholds can open and close with little to no explanation, and most people aren't aware of them at all. But there are people who are aware of them, and they study them and explore them, and we'll talk more about those people a little bit later in this video.
Oh, okay, wow. That's a very big bomb that Matt has just dropped on us here. Okay, the Dark Place is another dimension, and this dimension can only be accessed within the Cauldron Lake, right? Okay, and there's an entity called the Dark Presence that imbues some sort of shadow-like presence, and it escapes from this dark place, this other dimension, and it is the thing that's influencing the creatures and the human beings of this town. Okay? And the portal where the dark presence comes from is called a threshold. So it's like the anchor that connects our dimension to their dimension. Okay?
The enemy of the dark presence is light, and we saw evidence of this battle illustrated in Jake Fisher's story. The deer that Jake hit with his car had been affected by the dark presence, which is why it screamed in pain when Jake shone his flashlight on it. Jake too was affected by the dark presence, possibly as a result of this very encounter. Before attempting to leave Bright Falls, Jake reached out to Dr. Hartman for help. Hartman immediately recognized what Jake was going through and confirmed it by shining a light on Jake, which caused him to recoil in pain. But what Jake was experiencing was likely different than what had happened to that deer.
Wait, I don't get it. How is it that he is affected, Jake Fisher, how is it that he's affected by this dark presence? However, the doctor who's been living in this town for so many years has not been affected by it. And how is it that he knows what Jake Fisher is suffering from, right? And like there is no authority, like there's no police or government agency that is also, knowing about what's happening in Bright Falls and, quarantining this entire town because of the presence of this entity within the town. Why is the doctor allowing things to happen normally in this town while he knows the truth that there's this dark entity that is, invading or it's controlling other living beings in this dimension? Maybe he wants to experiment. Maybe he wants to see how this dark entity performs in our dimension. I'm not entirely sure, but he does have like a nefarious reason behind why he's allowing things to happen the way they are in this town. Yeah, he's not a good guy. He's not a good guy. He's not a good psychiatrist. He is someone who is just here just to experiment. And yeah, I don't trust him. I don't trust the doctor. And I don't trust the people of this town, because I'm still not sure whether they know what Dr. Hartman knows about, the lake and the dark entity that resides within the lake. I don't know if they know, and how many people within the town know about this. Yeah.
Jake had only been touched by the dark presence and wasn't fully taken over by it. When someone is taken by the dark presence, that's when they become covered in shadow.
So when was he touched by the dark presence? I don't remember Matt telling us when he was touched by some sort of darkness or shadow. When was he touched? Did it happen when he hit the deer and he was shining the light at the deer? Why weren't we shown something that was entering into Jake Fisher? Like some sort of shadow presence just going into his nose or into his ears or into his mouth. Nothing. So when did this happen?
Zane and Hartman did have some knowledge of the dark presence, but they didn't really fully comprehend it at the time and didn't really know its ways. On July 10th, 1970, Thomas Zane's girlfriend, Barbara Jagger, drowned in the waters of Cauldron Lake. Distraught, Zane was convinced by Hartman to use the power of the lake to bring her back to life. Zane wrote a poem that aimed to conjure her return, and he was overjoyed to discover that it worked. However, he soon came to realize that the resurrected Barbara Jagger was actually the Dark Presence wearing the skin of Barbara Jagger.
Wow. So that is Barbara Jagger's body. However, the Dark Presence has now completely controlled, this body. Maybe that's also what happened with the diver, who I'm assuming is Thomas Zane. In the beginning of the video where Matt was telling us about a diver bringing a body to the shore. Yeah, probably that body in that body bag was also being possessed by the Dark Presence at that time, and that's why it was able to walk away like nothing happened. Yeah, so Hartman really is a bad person. Hartman is experimenting with the supernatural abilities of this lake. He is using these artists' abilities to write poetry or to write stories. And of course, we know that with this lake, anything that has been written comes into reality. So yeah, Hartman is using Thomas for his experiments, just like he used Jake, and just like he's going to use Alan. Yeah, Hartman is not a good guy.
Zane tied her to a chair and cut her heart out, but she wouldn't die.
Why don't you just decapitate her or burn the body? Why are you cutting out people's hearts? Zane, you're funny.
Realizing that he had unleashed the Dark Presence into reality, he believed that he had only one option to undo his mistake. He decided to write himself and all of his work out of reality and to drown himself and the resurrected Barbara in Cauldron Lake. So he put on his diving suit, he held the body of Barbara Jagger close, and he jumped into the water for one last dive. And as they passed through the threshold at the bottom of the lake, they entered the Dark Place. The Dark Place is a universe all its own, and it's actually bigger than our universe.
When you say universe, do you mean like our universe, or are you just talking about planet Earth and it's bigger than planet Earth? Yeah, I think he actually does mean like a different plane, a different dimension, completely different universe. However, to say that it's bigger than our universe, I don't understand what you mean by that, because there is no boundary to our universe, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong about that, because the universe expands forever and it's infinity. So we can't really quantify it and say this is how big our universe is and how big their universe is. Yeah, maybe I'm nitpicking on that, but yeah, I'm not really understanding what he means there.
Barbara Jagger, or what was left of Barbara Jagger, and Thomas Zane dove down into the Dark Place, they were greeted by entities. Both light and dark presences came to see them. And just as a dark presence had taken over the body of Barbara Jagger, now a light presence, or a bright presence, was coming to Thomas Zane to take over his body. Now, before he entered the Dark Place, Thomas Zane wrote a poem, and the intention of that poem was to erase himself and all of his writing from reality, thus undoing what he did when he brought back the evil version of Barbara Jagger. But he also wrote a second poem. The bodies of the two lovers, now both taken over by their respective presences, moved upward to continue their eternal battle. And while this was happening, the essences of Barbara Jagger and Thomas Zane continued to descend deeper into the Dark Place.
Remember when I was talking about the area of effect of this power that resides within this lake? Since we've been told by Matt that Thomas wrote himself out of existence and wrote also Barbara out of existence, the area of effect, does it affect the entire world, the entire universe, or does it only affect those that live within Bright Falls? Because, yes, he wrote himself out of existence within Bright Falls. However, people that he knew from his home country before he emigrated to the United States of America, they might still know about this man called Thomas Zane. So essentially his existence is not really erased. That's why I'm asking about the area of effect of this power. Does it encompass this entire town? Does it encompass the entire planet? Does it encompass the entire galaxy and eventually the universe? Yeah. Sorry, guys. I just need accuracy on this.
As this was happening, the essence of Thomas Zane recited that second poem. And this poem was giving birth to a new baby universe that was being born inside of the dark place. So you had a universe inside of a universe. And
that is complicated.
And that universe was intended to be a sort of safe haven for the essences or souls of Zane and Jagger to live happily ever after. And
so their own version of heaven? Is that what it is? Okay. And how do you live in such a universe? In fact, how do the light and the dark entities exist in this dark place, this other dimension? Like, what are they? Are they like just gases, or do they have like a physical form in their dimension? What does their dimension look like? Is it utter darkness?
As far as we know, they're still there today. Cauldron Lake is a caldera. A caldera is formed by a volcanic eruption, and there's a underwater volcano beneath Cauldron Lake. When Thomas Zane banished himself and the dark version of Barbara Jagger into the lake, it caused that volcano to erupt, and it swallowed the island and the cabin whole, leaving them intact but bringing them down into the dark place. As I said before, the bodies of Barbara Jagger and Thomas Zane, now taken over by the dark and bright presences, continued their battle. These entities would also reach into reality from time to time, and there are people who have claimed to have spoken to or seen Thomas Zane, coming to them in dreams or through radio and television signals, appearing to be wearing his diving suit.
But I thought we were told he wrote himself out of existence. So how is it possible that the townspeople know about Thomas Zane if Thomas Zane wrote himself out of existence? I don't understand this part. I'm sorry, Matt, I just don't understand it. Maybe I'm not listening to you properly, but yeah, it's just not making sense to me.
People in Bright Falls also claimed to see Barbara Jagger, and those claims led to a sort of urban legend known as the Scratching Hag, which is a witch with a penchant for darkness who also likes to eat children. According to the stories, she lives in a house that's able to move around from place to place, and she's cloaked in a shroud of darkness that makes it difficult for people to really make out her features. The bright presence, in the form of Thomas Zane, would do what it could to keep the dark presence in check. However, in 1976, there was another event that caused the threshold to the dark place to open, and once again unleashed the dark presence upon reality. This event was caused by a heavy metal band called the Old Gods of Asgard. The band owned a farm in Bright Falls, which acted as a sort of headquarters for the group. It had a large farmhouse, an outdoor concert area, and a distillery that the band would use to make their own moonshine. The farm is located near Cauldron Lake, and the band would use water from the lake to make their moonshine. Just like Thomas Zane before them, the old gods of Asgard experimented with the powers of the lake. It appears that drinking the moonshine made with Cauldron Lake water would give the band visions, and sometimes these were visions of the future. Back in the 70s, the band was writing songs referencing events that wouldn't take place until decades later. On top of that, the songs written and performed by the band on that farm were prone to altering reality. And during that 1976 event, a great flood hit the area, and the proverbial door to the dark place was opened for the dark presence.
So not only does this power within the lake, the Cauldron Lake, give you the ability to write things into existence or change reality, but it also gives you the power to see into the future. And that's what has been happening with the old gods of Asgard. They've been drinking the water from this place. They get the power to see into the future. And also because they are writers, anything that they write also comes into existence. Interesting. Okay.
According to their recollection of events, the band fought off the dark presence, which at the time was still wearing the skin of Barbara Jagger. She summoned a dark army to protect herself, but the band was persistent and they were eventually victorious in pushing back the dark presence.
How many band members are there? I mean, she brought a dark army. I'm assuming it must be hundreds or maybe thousands of dark entities. So how many band members are there? And how is it possible that they all this band defeated such a large army of dark entities led by Barbara?
However, the event took quite a toll on members of the band. One of the members, known as Odin Anderson, cut out his own right eye so that he might more resemble his namesake, Odin, the one-eyed god. His brother, Tor Anderson, was struck by lightning during the event. The Anderson brothers would eventually wind up in the care of Dr. Emil Hartmann.
Wait a minute, it's only two? Only two. Two people. Two. 1, 2. Wow, okay, maybe they wrote it into existence that we are defeating Barbara and her army of shadows, and that's what happened. It came into existence, because that's what is done around this lake. Whatever you write or whatever poetry you do or anything that comes to mind and you write it down, it becomes reality. So maybe that's how they defeated Barbara and her dark army.
And become semi-permanent residents of the Cauldron Lake Lodge, but they would remain vigilant in their opposition to the Dark Presence. After that event, the Dark Presence would remain in a sort of state of limbo, not entirely banished, but also not entirely present in reality. This is because the Anderson brothers were able to fend the Dark Presence off, but they didn't completely seal it away. The threshold, or the door, so to speak, to the dark place was left cracked open. The Dark Presence would lie in wait, anticipating someone to come through and open the door once again. Dr. Emil Hartmann was not an artist. He didn't possess creativity, and so without the poetry of Thomas Zane to drive his research into Cauldron Lake and its powers, Hartmann was compelled to find a new partner for this endeavor.
And that's why he started this initiative to create this creator's dilemma, medical procedure for artists who have got, blockages in terms of them creating their work. And that's why he based it and situated in the town of Bright Falls and close to the lake, in fact. Okay, interesting, yeah.
This search for a new collaborator was the real reason behind Hartmann having an artist-focused practice at the Cauldron Lake Lodge. The lodge existed for Hartman to use as a sort of laboratory where he would lure in troubled artists, sedate them, and then exploit their creative works, hoping to harness the powers of Cauldron Lake for himself.
And that's what happened with Jake Fisher.
There's also some evidence to suggest that he may have believed he could even harness the powers of the Dark Presence.
Water break.
After speaking with Alice Wake, Hartman anticipated the arrival of Alan and Alice, and he sent out a lackey named Ben Mott to track the couple. The Dark Presence also anticipated their arrival, and it sabotaged their cabin rental. Unbeknownst to Alan, the Dark Presence had already started to take over Carl Stuckey, the man who they were renting their cabin from.
But we were told that the Dark Presence is sealed, under the lake due to the actions of the old gods of Asgard's, the rock group, what they did, in terms of sealing off the Dark Presence in the lake. So how is it that their influence is still being felt within the town? How is it that there's still people who are being possessed by this Dark Presence? I don't get it. I'm sorry. I don't get it.
While stopping at the Oh Dear Diner to get the cabin keys from Stuckey, Alan was intercepted by the Dark Presence, wearing
Barbara.
the skin of Barbara Jagger. The Dark Presence gave Alan the keys to the bird leg cabin. Although it had sunk down to the dark place, the Dark Presence used its power to make it appear above the water to the Wakes, and Alan and Alice unknowingly headed into the doomed cabin. As the couple settled in, Alice revealed her ulterior motive for the trip.
Miss Wake, I'm sorry, but can you put on some pants or something, or cover yourself, because hey.
She presented Alan with a typewriter and let him know about Dr. Emil Hartman. Alan was furious and he stormed out of the cabin. Moments later, there was a sudden power outage. Alice Wake was deathly afraid of the dark, and upon hearing her screams for help, Alan ran back inside, only to realize that Alice had fallen from the balcony of the cabin into the water. Alan dove after her, but was unable to find Alice. In a frenzied and confused state, Alan emerged from Cauldron Lake, and was greeted once more by the Dark Presence in the form of Barbara Jagger. The Dark Presence had Wake under a spell and led him back into the cabin. The Dark Presence told Wake that Alice had died and that he needed to get to his typewriter and set things right. Dazed and confused, Alan listened to the Dark Presence and began writing a manuscript. The Dark Presence directed Alan's writing, guiding him toward creating a story that would set it free to wreak havoc on reality.
But you're already free, Barbara, or aka Dark Presence. You already exist in our dimension. You're able to walk around the town of Bright Falls and do as you please and influence other living beings. So I don't understand, what more freedom do you want? What more freedom do you want, Barbara? I don't get it. That's why, guys, I told you before, I don't understand when Matt was saying that, the Dark Presence is sealed by the old gods of Asgard metal rock group, what they did. And yet the influence of the Dark Presence is still being felt within the town. So how is it being sealed away? How were they, shut out of our dimension if their presence is still here around amongst us in the town of Bright Falls. Yeah. Sorry, guys.
Alan spent the next week working on this manuscript, but over the course of that week, he began to realize what was happening. He learned how the dark place worked and how his writing could affect reality. He also learned about the lost poetry of Thomas Zane. This was possible because although Zane wrote himself and his works out of reality, he also made a loophole for himself. Any items placed within a shoebox, any shoebox, would be exempt from the reality-bending powers of the Dark Place and Cauldron Lake. He left a shoebox full of his poetry in the cabin, which Alan discovered. Alan realized that if he wanted to save Alice, he would need to write himself into the manuscript as the hero of the story. He began to change the story, using elements from the works of Thomas Zane and moving further away from what the Dark Presence wanted. Alan wrote the story that he believed he needed to write, and it turned out to be a sort of horror story. Due to the powers of Cauldron Lake, he was now subject to the dangers of that story, and the danger and risk of failure had to be there in order for the story to work. It had to be written in such a way that the hero might not survive. In general, for the reality-bending powers of Cauldron Lake to be successful, the artist must make a realistic scenario. Alan can't just give himself superpowers. He has to write in such a way that meshes cleanly with reality. The writing has to make sense, the actions and motivations of the characters in it need to be believable and consistent.
But who decides all of that? Who decides that it's believable when you do it in that certain manner? Is it the Dark Presence that decides that? Or not the Dark Presence, the Dark Place, the other dimension, you know? How does the dimension determine that this is how the story should be like? Because as a writer, you know, this is your own decision on how this story is going to plan out. So how is it that this dimension decides upon itself that, okay, I don't like the way your story is going. It doesn't sound believable. It doesn't sound plausible. I'm not going to allow you to create this new reality. Like, anyways.
Collaboration with Thomas Zane, or more likely in collaboration with the Bright Presence in the form of Thomas Zane, Alan was able to break free from the grip of the Dark Presence long enough to exit the cabin and get to his vehicle. Alan then drove a short distance before crashing his car and losing consciousness. Upon waking, Alan had no memory of the previous week spent writing in the cabin, and he did not yet know that he was experiencing a reality that he had shaped with his own writing. Alan's last memory was diving into Cauldron Lake to save Alice, and he would spend the next 7 days putting everything else together.
Just like with Jake Fisher, you know, he also went, he tried to escape, he became unconscious, and in his unconscious state, he was doing things that he does not remember. Yeah. So you could say like it's the same situation that Jake was experiencing. Now Alan is going through the same thing.
Seeking help after the crash, Alan decided to make his way to a nearby gas station, but had to pass through the woods to get there. Throughout that journey, Alan faced opposition from a number of people who had been taken by the Dark Presence. This included a maniacal, axe-wielding Carl Stuckey, who had now fully completed his transformation into one of the Taken. Alan was forced to defend himself and killed Stuckey. He did this by first using light to break away the shield of darkness that was protecting Stuckey, and then shooting him to death. However, Carl Stuckey's body disappeared without a trace, as had the bodies of various other unnamed individuals who had been pursuing Alan throughout the woods. Although he may not have remembered it at the time, this was all very similar to a dream he recently had. During the trip to Bright Falls, Alan was sleeping in the car while Alice drove. In this dream, Alan was driving a car at night and hit a hitchhiker who had suddenly appeared on the road. When Alan got out of the car to check on him, the hitchhiker was already gone, and the road behind him had been covered up by a brick wall. Somehow, Alan knew that he had to get to a nearby lighthouse. As he headed toward it, the hitchhiker reappeared, covered in shadow, and identifying himself as one of Alan's creations. The hitchhiker said that Alan was now stuck inside of a story, and that the hitchhiker was going to take revenge on Wake for playing God with his characters. Alan ran away and eventually came to a bridge, and he saw a man on the other side who was motioning him into a nearby cabin. This man was Clay Stewart, author of the Alan Wake files. Although Alan didn't seem to recognize Clay, Clay definitely recognized Alan. Clay Stewart was having a series of recurring dreams in which Alan Wake would appear. Through these dreams, Clay began to know and understand things about Alan and his life that were not public knowledge. It was this bizarre series of dreams that spurred Clay to investigate the disappearance of Alan Wake. In this particular dream, Clay was mauled by the hitchhiker while Alan was watching, seemingly stuck inside of a cabin. As the hitchhiker made his way toward Alan, a bright presence blew open the back door and guided Alan to safety. The
Must be Thomas Zane.
presence recited a poem to Alan, the meaning of which Alan didn't yet understand. This was the bright presence in the form of Thomas Zane, which had entered Alan's dream and was trying to teach Alan how to fight the dark presence and the people taken over by it. From here on out, whenever we talk about the bright presence in the form of Thomas Zane, we'll refer to them as the Diver. And whether Alan knew it or not, the knowledge that the Diver gave him in this dream wound up being crucial to Alan's survival as he traversed the forest. Well on his way to the gas station, Alan began to find pages of a manuscript titled Departure, which was the title that he had intended to use for his next novel. The pages appeared to describe the scenarios that Alan was finding himself in. He didn't realize it yet, but these were the same pages he was writing during his previous lost week in the cabin, and they were being scattered around by the Diver. Alan wasn't the only person finding these manuscript pages. A number of them were found by a former FBI agent named Robert Nightingale, who eventually began pursuing Alan Wake.
New character. Okay. Robert Nightingale. FBI agent. Alright.
Alan reached the gas station, which was empty, seemingly abandoned by its former owner, Carl Stuckey. He noticed a sign advertising the upcoming local festival, Deerfest, which was now 1 week closer than it was when he had first arrived in Bright Falls. It was at that moment that Alan realized he had lost an entire week. As he entered the building, Alan saw a television turn on by itself, and a strange transmission showing Alan in the bird leg cabin played on the screen. Again, Alan didn't realize it at the time, but this transmission was showing Alan what had happened to himself during his lost week. Alan shambled to the phone and dialed the local sheriff. Sheriff Sarah Breaker responded to the call and arrived at the scene to find Alan Wake visibly traumatized and sporting a large head wound. She knew that Carl Stuckey had gone missing, so she was very skeptical about the man that she found inside of his gas station. Alan tried to explain his situation to the sheriff, leaving out the part about battling shadowy beings, but letting her know that he and his wife had been staying in the cabin at Cauldron Lake and that he had been searching for her after she disappeared. Sheriff Breaker listened to Alan's claims, but she knew that the island was lost in the volcanic eruption of 1970, and she brought Wake to the site to prove it. Alan was confused and distraught. After being checked out by a local doctor, Alan received an anonymous phone call. The call came from a person claiming to have kidnapped Alice Wake. He told Alan to meet him at a point called Lover's Peak, located within the nearby Elderwood National Park. Alan was instructed to come alone and to not involve police in the matter. At the same time, Alan's agent, Barry Wheeler, was making his way to Bright Falls. After not hearing from Alan or Alice for an entire week, he became concerned. He pulled up to the sheriff's station just in time to catch Alan engaged in a confrontation with Dr. Emil Hartman, who was there to apologize for two of his patients, the aforementioned Anderson brothers, Tor and Odin, who were being unruly during one of their recent escapes from the Cauldron Lake Lodge. Although they were seen as permanent residents of the lodge, the brothers would find a way to get out and raise hell around Bright Falls whenever they had the chance to. Seeing Hartman brought Alan back to his fight with Alice, and in a fit of rage, Alan struck Hartman in the face. Hartman didn't care to press charges, and Barry hurried Alan out of the building as the two headed toward the visitor center at Elderwood National Park, where they would rent a cabin and wait for nightfall before Alan would head toward Lover's Peak. Alan attempted to explain the events of the previous night to Barry, but Barry had a hard time believing Alan. Alan Wake had been a long-time vocal skeptic, often being very critical of anyone who believed in the supernatural or pseudoscience or anything that required more faith than proof to believe in. Still, Alan was Barry's longtime friend and his most successful client, so Barry did what he could to stay supportive, especially since he knew that he wouldn't be able to change Alan's mind about going to meet the kidnapper. Upon nightfall, Alan started his trek to Lover's Peak, leaving Barry behind in the rented cabin. As darkness covered the area, the dark presence once again made itself known to Alan Wake. Alan saw a power outage at the visitor center and saw Rusty, a park ranger who worked there, badly wounded on the ground. Alan had talked to Rusty earlier that day when he came to pick up the keys to the cabin that he and Barry were renting. Rusty was almost in a trance, having been deeply traumatized by whatever had attacked him.
I'm sure the dark presence has also infiltrated him now.
It was clearly the work of the dark presence, and before too long, Alan ran into Rusty once more, only this time he had been completely taken over. Just like Stucky before him, Alan was forced to confront Rusty with lethal force. And again, just like Stucky, Rusty's corpse vanished without explanation. As he continued toward the peak, more taken individuals showed up to impede Alan's progress, and eventually, Wake was overwhelmed by them. He dropped both his flashlight and his gun, and seemed to be entirely out of luck. It was at this time that a burst of red light filled the air, and an unidentified man helped clear the Taken away from Alan. Alan soon recognized the man as the kidnapper, and reluctantly followed him to Lover's Peak, as they worked together to battle the hordes of Taken infesting the forest.
So he kidnapped your wife? I don't think so. Your wife fell into the lake. You know, why would the kidnapper abduct your wife, you know, going into the lake and then probably swimming all the way to shore? You would be able to see them. There's no way that someone can hold their breath for so long under the water and, you know, get to shore. So it's definitely not him. He didn't take your wife. It might be the dark presence that's controlling this person, but I know for certain that it is the dark presence that took your wife. It is Barbara who is orchestrating all of this. And this person, I'm not entirely sure where does he come into this, but I guess we'll hear about him right now. Yeah, but he's not the one.
Once they reached the peak, the kidnapper made it known that he was aware of Alan's departure manuscript, and that he wanted the rest of the pages in exchange for Alice Wake. He claimed that he would harm Alice if Alan didn't deliver. The problem was, Alan didn't have the rest of the pages, and he hadn't even finished writing the story. Incensed, Alan lashed out at the kidnapper, and the two tumbled over a guardrail, landing on a hiking path below. The kidnapper dropped his handgun in the tussle and saw Alan reach for it. The kidnapper then ran off before Alan could fire a shot at him. Alan decided to head back to Barry and plan his next move. While Barry initially thought that Alan was going mad, he had now come to realize that the horrors Alan was describing were entirely real. A flock of ravens that had been touched by the dark presence were assaulting the cabin where Barry was waiting for Alan. As Alan worked his way back toward Barry, he was contacted again by the kidnapper, who gave Alan a deadline of 2 days to deliver the finished manuscript. Alan rescued Barry from the birds and tried to get to work on finishing Departure. However, he found himself unable to write. During this time, Barry was contacted by Rose Marigold, the waitress and Alan Wake fan from the Oh Dear Diner. She claimed to have Alan's missing pages, but unbeknownst to Barry, she was actually under the spell of the dark presence. This was another case of someone having been touched by the dark presence rather than being completely taken over by it.
I assumed that the supposed kidnapper is also being touched by the shadow or by the darkness, and is also being manipulated, just like Rose Marigold. Yeah, just like her. But I'm not entirely sure if he is actually under the control of the dark presence, like Rose. Yeah, because really, I don't believe him when he said that he, kidnapped Alan Wake's wife, Alice Wake. I don't believe that. We would have seen them, swimming to shore. We would have seen something, but instead, she just fell into the lake, and she was probably taken by the dark presence, and that's what happened. How this man came to know of all of this, of why Alan's wife was taken away, and all these manuscripts, I don't know. How does he know all of this stuff? But yeah, he did not abduct her. Yeah.
Alan and Barry showed up at Rose's home to retrieve the pages, but were seemingly drugged by Rose. Alan found himself deep in a dream in which he was being taunted by Barbara Jagger. When he awoke, Barry and Rose were unconscious in the next room. Alan made his way outside, only to be confronted by former FBI agent Robert Nightingale and Bright Falls area law enforcement. Recklessly, Nightingale opened fire on Wake, and Alan had to retreat into a nearby ravine and attempt to flee the area. While Nightingale's actions may...
They said he's former FBI, yet he's wearing the FBI regalia here. Huh.
have seemed unprovoked, he was actually operating under the assumption that Alan Wake was responsible for the death of his former partner, Agent Finn. Finn was someone who had been taken by the Dark Presence, and Nightingale witnessed the beginning of his partner's transformation, which culminated in Finn disappearing, and Nightingale presuming that Finn had died. This led to Nightingale becoming obsessed with finding out what happened to his partner. Nightingale began to drink very heavily to cope with the loss, and subsequently lost his job at the FBI. While we don't know exactly what happened to Agent Finn, we do know that Nightingale's investigation eventually brought him to Bright Falls, where he interviewed a number of residents and found the manuscript pages that led him to believe that Alan Wake was the person responsible for the darkness that had taken his partner. As Alan fled the scene on foot, he was pursued by local law enforcement, led by Nightingale. At the same time, the dark presence had begun to take the form of a tornado that was trailing Wake. The tornado was wreaking havoc on the town of Bright Falls, and on the police that were pursuing Alan. Wake eventually made it to the KBF-FM studios, a local radio station which was home to a DJ named Pat Main. Main had met Alan a week or so prior when Alan and Alice were on the ferry into Bright Falls. Alan had hoped to find respite at the station, but before long, Agent Nightingale had closed in on Alan's location. Nightingale took another shot at Alan, and Alan was again forced to flee. Nightingale was immediately reprimanded by Sheriff Breaker. Alan kept running into the night and eventually hit his 2-day deadline with the kidnapper. Alan had been instructed to meet the kidnapper at the old coal mine, which had since been turned into a museum. Alan waited all day for the kidnapper, but he never showed. Instead, he called Alan after nightfall and told him that there had been a change of plans. Alan was to now meet the kidnapper at the lookout point on Mirror Peak, which overlooked Cauldron Lake. Left with no other choice, Alan worked his way toward Mirror Peak, all the while pursued by the Taken. As he finally approached the lookout point, he could hear the voice of the kidnapper pleading with someone. The kidnapper was speaking to the dark presence, begging for forgiveness. The kidnapper admitted that he never actually had Alan's wife.
Obviously.
And that he had no idea where Alice was. As Alan made his way closer, both he and the kidnapper were swept up by the dark tornado and thrown into the nearby water. Alan was nearly unconscious, but a hand emerged to bring him to the surface. That hand belonged to none other than Dr. Emil Hartman. We already know the true nature of Hartman's work at the Cauldron Lake Lodge, but this knowledge was unknown to Alan at the time. Hartman had sedated Alan and attempted to convince him that he had been a patient at the lodge for a while now. According to Hartman's version of events, Alice Wake had drowned, and Alan had been having severe episodes in which he concocted a false reality to cope with the loss of his wife.
Again, with this notion that the wife has drowned. Just like with Barbara Jagger. She drowned. I don't think this lady drowned. I think, Hartman did something in order for the poet, Thomas Zane, to become desperate enough to write down something that would come into reality where, his wife his wife, Barbara Jagger, would return into existence. Just like with, what's his name? Sorry, I forgot his name right now. Not Jake. Alan Wake, yeah. Alan Wake's wife also fell into the water somehow. Somehow she fell into the water. She's been drowned by the water, and she's been taken further and deeper into the water by the dark presence. Probably the dark presence learned how to do that from the doctor, from Hartman, because I suspect that Hartman is the one who pushed Barbara into the lake and probably drowned her that way in order for him to get what he wants from Thomas Zane. And now the dark presence is copying what the doctor did in order for it to get what it wants, to escape from its dimension and enter into our dimension. Yeah.
All of the strange things that Alan had experienced in Bright Falls up until this point were merely delusions created by Alan because he couldn't accept that Alice was dead. However, Hartman was fully aware of the situation. He knew that Alan had interacted with the Dark Presence, and he knew that Alan's writings were already having an effect on reality. Hartman hoped to become Alan's editor on the manuscript and coach his writing in the same way that he guided the writing of Thomas Zane. Alan knew that he was being lied to, but felt that he had to play along for the time being. Before too long, a power outage struck the lodge, which appeared to be directly connected to the Dark Presence and a large storm that was brewing in the area. Amidst the chaos, the Anderson brothers attacked one of the orderlies at the lodge and encouraged Alan to move forward in his battle against the Dark Presence. Prior to the blackout, they confided in Alan, letting him know that they too had engaged in such a battle in the past, and acknowledged that it was partly their fault that the Dark Presence was able to push into reality. They also told Alan that he needed to go to their farm and find what they referred to as the message. As we've seen, the Dark Presence can cause memory loss in people. Knowing this, the Anderson brothers created a song called The Poet and the Muse, which was intended to act as a sort of crash course for anyone who might be facing the Dark Presence in the future. The song was the message that the Anderson brothers had been referring to, and it was just the thing that Alan needed to defeat the Dark Presence and save Alice. Alan took the opportunity to escape the lodge, but first headed for the offices so that he could retrieve his seized belongings. He lifted a key from the unconscious orderly and headed into the restricted area of the lodge. There, he saw a photograph that put his entire situation into a much more clear perspective. In the photograph, standing among the staff of the lodge, was the kidnapper, Ben Mott. Wake immediately recognized the man, but what he may not have realized was that Mott had been tracking Alan as soon as he got close to Bright Falls, and that Mott was there on the ferry that Alan and Alice took into town. Alan also found a series of recordings that Hartman had made while talking to Alice on the phone prior to their arrival in Bright Falls. At one point in his journey, Alan received a strange call from Alice, only he knew that she didn't sound quite right. This was because that call had been manufactured by Emil Hartman, who used these recordings to trick Alan. As he continued through the lodge, Alan unexpectedly ran into Barry Wheeler, who explained that Hartman and his goons had locked him in a room after he came around looking for Alan. Barry also revealed that he had stolen Rose's prized Alan Wake cutout in revenge for giving them false information about the manuscript pages. Apparently, Barry didn't realize that Rose had been under the control of the Dark Presence at the time, but regardless, he hung on to the cardboard cutout as if it were the most important thing in the world. Next, Alan entered Hartman's office, where he found his manuscript pages, as well as the handgun that he had on him before showing up at the lodge. Hartman emerged from the shadows and attempted to bargain with Alan, finally coming clean about the ruse that he had subjected Alan to. Alan was furious, but before the situation could escalate, the Dark Presence intervened and Alan locked Hartman in the office, alone with the Dark Presence. Well,
it's about time that the Dark Presence would take over Dr. Hartman. I mean, this guy's been here for years, and the Dark Presence hasn't even tried or become interested in taking over his body, like everybody else in this town, like all the other creatures in this town as well.
Alan couldn't be sure of Hartman's fate. Hartman did survive that encounter with the Dark Presence, and we'll come back around to resolve his story a bit later. Alan and Barry battled through the lodge and eventually made their way to the Anderson farm, where they were again confronted by more of the Taken. When they finally got to the Andersons' farmhouse, they found the message that the Anderson brothers had been talking about. The message was on a vinyl record, which Alan and Barry listened to as they partook in some of the special moonshine that the brothers had distilled. The song told Alan that he needed to seek the Lady of the Light, which he immediately recognized as Cynthia Weaver, a local eccentric who he first met while stopping in at the Oh Dear Diner just after arriving in Bright Falls. Cynthia Weaver had been a longtime resident of the town and was a bit of a local historian. Cynthia Weaver had been close to Thomas Zane, and she actually had an unreciprocated crush on him. She claimed to have kept in touch with Zane even after he disappeared, although it's unclear if she was talking to Thomas Zane or if she was talking to the diver. Regardless, she was well aware of what had happened to Zane and Barbara, and she had dedicated herself to holding a guard against the dark presence in Bright Falls. Thomas Zane entrusted Cynthia Weaver with a shoebox full of very important items, and she kept that shoebox in part of an old decommissioned military base. She called that place the Well-Lit Room. It was a room that was entirely void of any shadow. Thomas Zane knew that the dark presence might return to reality one day, and if so, there would need to be some sort of mechanism to fight it back, and he hid that failsafe in that shoebox. However, Alan and Barry weren't quite yet ready to meet Cynthia Weaver. First, they needed some time to rest, but secondly, they needed to get drunk. Once Alan eventually drifted off to sleep, he found himself experiencing a dream that allowed him to piece together what had happened during his lost week. He saw that after he dove into Cauldron Lake in search of Alice, he had been taken in by Barbara Jagger and compelled to write. He also saw how the diver helped him escape the cabin. Alan was now more well-equipped for this journey than ever, but before he could act on this newfound information, he was awakened by former FBI agent Robert Nightingale, who then arrested Alan and Barry.
How? Since he's former FBI, he was fired. Or maybe it's like a citizen's arrest. Okay.
Accompanied by Sheriff Breaker, Nightingale brought Alan and Barry to a holding cell at the sheriff's department. Alan began to break down, which alarmed Sheriff Breaker. Nightingale thought that it was some sort of ruse, but Breaker stood her ground, letting Nightingale know that she was onto him and the fact that he wasn't actually there on official business. Suddenly, Nightingale realized what was happening. He had seen this all before, written on a manuscript page. Nightingale's fate had been sealed. The dark presence broke the door down and swept him away. There was now no room for denying it. Sheriff Breaker knew that something catastrophic was happening in Bright Falls. However, as a longtime resident of the area, Breaker wasn't entirely unfamiliar with these sorts of strange occurrences.
Okay, so there are some people who know about what's going on in this town. It's not just the doctor, Dr. Emil Hartman, who understands that this place has got some sort of dark presence, permeating around the town. But also the sheriff knows about this as well. But what happened to Nightingale was just out of the blue. He was just taken just like that. Not even like why? Why did this only happen now? Why hasn't it happened before? What's so special about it happening right now? Is it because Alan Wake was under threat? His life was threatened by this former FBI agent, and the dark presence needs Alan Wake to complete his manuscripts, to complete the work for the dark presence, for it to escape completely from the other dimension. Maybe that's why. Maybe it sensed that Alan was going to be killed. It has to take action, and it took action by taking away the former FBI agent, Robert Nightingale. Yeah. I'm just assuming this, guys. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong.
There was a group of people in the area who were uniquely equipped to handle situations like this, and Breaker gave Barry instructions to call those people and to give them the code phrase Night Springs. One of the people at the top of that list was Sheriff Breaker's father, Frank Breaker. Frank Breaker had also been in law enforcement. He worked as a police officer in New York City for a time, but also worked for a particular branch of the federal government. I mentioned earlier that there are people out there who study and explore thresholds, and while there are disparate groups aware of such things, there's one group in particular that is likely the most knowledgeable. That group is known as the Federal Bureau of Control, or the FBC.
Federal Bureau of Control. So it's a government agency. Okay. FBI, FBC.
They're a shadowy arm of the US federal government, with a focus on all things supernatural, although they prefer to use the term paranatural. This organization works hard to remain largely unseen by the public. However, they aren't completely invisible. Frank Breaker is a former FBC agent, and when he received the call from Barry Wheeler, he immediately sprung into action. Frank Breaker had seen all sorts of seemingly unexplainable phenomena over the years, and knew that he had to be ready for anything. He dialed a former colleague of his, William Kirkland, who at the time was the head of investigations at the FBC. Bright Falls had already been on the FBC's radar due to some of the events that took place there in the 1970s. The FBC calls those sorts of occurrences AWEs, or Altered World Events. When the threshold beneath Cauldron Lake opened up in 1976, that was an AWE. Everything that Alan Wake had been experiencing in Bright Falls, that was also an AWE. Frank Breaker's call to Kirkland put Bright Falls on the map once again for the FBC, and they would continue to monitor the area for years to come. Frank Breaker coordinated with local law enforcement to address the chaos being caused by the Dark Presence, while his daughter accompanied Barry Wheeler and Alan Wake to the well-lit room. The trio was split up due to the Dark Presence interfering, but they eventually all made it to their destination. Once there, Alan was met with the shoebox left by Zane.
It was said that this room does not create any shadows, yet I see shadows here. I see lines of shadows from the structures, from the pillars and stuff like that. So this place is not 100% lit. You know, the shadow can use these parts where there is no light and infiltrate the group. But anyways.
Inside of it was a manuscript page, which described a scene from Alan's childhood. It explained that young Alan Wake was afraid of the dark. To help Alan conquer his fear, his mother gave him an old light switch, which she called the clicker. She said that it had been given to her by Alan's father. Now, Alan never knew his father, so anything that had passed through his hands had a sort of mythical quality to Alan. Alan's mother explained to Alan that all he had to do was press the clicker and it would instantly vanquish any beasts that were hiding in the shadows. The page went on to describe Alan holding the clicker as he stood at the edge of Cauldron Lake, ready to dive in and face the Dark Presence head on. Alan didn't totally understand what was happening. The page had been written by Thomas Zane, but how did Zane know about Alan's childhood?
Maybe he's your father. You never know. You just never know. He might be your father.
Beyond that, how did the clicker get into the shoebox? As we mentioned before, Alice Wake was also afraid of the dark. And a few years prior, the couple experienced a power outage in their New York City apartment. After lighting a few candles, Alan pulled out the clicker and explained its origins to his wife. He gave the clicker to Alice that night, but now it was there in front of him in the shoebox. Alan declared that he had to finish this journey on his own, and he set forth for Cauldron Lake with the clicker in hand. He left Cynthia Weaver, Sarah Breaker, and Barry Wheeler behind, none of them knowing if they would ever see him again. The Dark Presence tried to impede his progress, but he pushed through and eventually reached the edge of Cauldron Lake, just like it was written on the manuscript page. Alan dove into the lake and passed through the threshold into the dark place. Immediately, the Dark Presence began to play tricks on him. In the dark place, reality operates on a sort of dream logic, and almost anything is possible. The dark place will appear different to different people as they explore it. Alan found himself back in his New York City apartment, but he knew that the whole thing was an illusion cooked up by the Dark Presence. With guidance from the diver, Alan was able to break through this illusion, and used the power of his own creativity and imagination to literally forge a path to the Bird Leg Cabin, where he came face to face with the Dark Presence, still wearing the skin of Barbara Jagger. The Dark Presence let Alan know that it would easily find a new host if it needed to, but Alan was undeterred. He pulled Jagger close to him and shoved the clicker into the hole where her heart had been. He pressed the clicker and filled Jagger's body with light, destroying the vessel that the Dark Presence had been occupying. This resolved the story of departure, and Alan's intended ending had been seen to fruition. Alice emerged from Cauldron Lake, confused and alone, but safe for the time being. The citizens of Bright Falls were celebrating Deerfest, almost as if the events of the past week hadn't happened at all. Except they did happen. Rose Marigold was clearly affected by her brush with Barbara Jagger, and other people who were taken or affected by the Dark Presence appeared to also be suffering long-term consequences.
What about those who were killed by Alan Wake? Are they back as well? Because he killed at least 2 people who were controlled by the Dark Presence, and their bodies just, disappeared. Yeah.
In general, only people who have been directly affected by the Dark Presence or the powers of Cauldron Lake are able to really remember these shifts in reality that occur. However, for some people, small remnants might remain, and over time, those remnants become folklore and urban legends, like the Scratching Hag. Surely, the events that took place during the 2010 Bright Falls AWE have gone on to form their own legend for the people in the area. The FBC would arrive in Bright Falls shortly after the Altered World event that was occurring there had finished. Over the next few years, they would interview and monitor several key figures related to that AWE. Clay Stewart was interviewed and placed under indefinite surveillance by the organization.
I thought Clay Stewart was mauled or, axed to death by... I forgot by who exactly. I forgot the person. I think it was Stuckey, Carol Stuckey. He's the one who held the axe and started, butchering him with the axe. I thought he was killed.
The FBC suspected that he may have minor paranatural abilities. People with these qualities are categorized by the FBC as para-utilitarians, and they suspected that Alan Wake was also a para-utilitarian. Their investigation into the AWE and his disappearance also led them to interview Alice Wake. The FBC identified that Alice Wake had been trapped in the threshold during the 2010 Bright Falls AWE, and that she suffered some memory loss during that time. After the event, Alice continued her work as a photographer and eventually dipped into making some short films as well. During her interview with the FBC, she mentioned that she had been seeing someone who looked like her missing husband, although she described this person as a monster wearing Alan's skin. She was able to capture a photograph of this person, who no doubt looked very similar, if not identical, to Alan Wake.
Wow. Maybe he's possessed by the dark presence. Yeah.
However, this was not Alan Wake. While the identity of the person in this photo may be open to debate, it is likely an entity named Mr. Scratch.
Mr. Scratch? Okay.
Alan encountered Mr. Scratch very briefly in the dark place before entering the bird-leg cabin on his journey to defeat the dark presence. Mr. Scratch is a doppelganger of Alan Wake, born from the most negative and selfish parts of his own psyche. When Alan dove back down into the dark place, he became fractured, his rational mind separated from his body, and it may have been through a similar process that another part of him separated to become Mr. Scratch. Under guidance from the diver, Alan was eventually able to mostly reunite the different parts of his mind and regain the lucidity that he would need to navigate the dark place. While writing Departure, in order to save Alice, Alan wound up putting himself in the dark place instead of her, and there was no sure way for him to escape. Unfortunately, as far as we know, Alan is still stuck inside of the dark place, presumed dead by many who knew him. On top of that, Mr. Scratch is still at large, terrorizing people who were close to Alan and giving fuel to the urban legends and rumors surrounding Alan's disappearance.
So if Alan's wife, Alice, can kill Mr. Scratch, will everything be fine? I mean, it won't be fine. I mean, Alan is still trapped inside the dark realm, or the dark place. But, you know, killing this doppelganger of him, won't it bring peace to Alice Wake as well as to everybody else that knows Alan Wake? Or will it become a problem for him? You know, having a part of himself killed. Because that's what Mr. Scratch is. He's another part of his personality, a part of his soul that's been fractured.
Not much is known about Mr. Scratch, but we do know that he's an entity that serves a higher power, with their
Dark presence.
Their ultimate goal being to break into reality and change it to their will.
Dark presence.
Scratch is evil and murderous, and he has the power to freely cross the barrier between reality and the dark place. He has gone out of his way to show Alan what he's capable of, and Alan has done all that he can to thwart Scratch's evil plans. However, Alan has not been able to completely defeat this foe. Beyond his struggles with Mr. Scratch, Alan continues to try to find a way to right himself out of the dark place, although his attempts so far have been unsuccessful. We've established that Thomas Zane was allegedly in touch with Cynthia Weaver, and similarly, Alan Wake has tried to send messages out to reality from the dark place. Messages from the dark place can travel through dreams, as well as television and radio signals. Messages can also enter the dark place, and while the mechanism that controls that flow of information is still a mystery to us, Alan has received glimpses of reality and has put those images into his writing. It is very much possible that Alan had this sort of power even before entering the dark place, possibly confusing his own form of clairvoyance with inspiration or creativity. Through prolonged isolation in the dark place, it seems as if Alan has begun to suspect that he may have a paranatural link to the world around him, one that allows him to see and know things that he couldn't possibly know otherwise, similar to how Clay Stewart began to know things about Alan Wake that he couldn't explain. After the 2010 Bright Falls AWE, Barry Wheeler reached out to the Old Gods of Asgard and became their manager. By 2012, the band was touring in support of a new single. Although the band was as unruly as ever, and their aging bodies really weren't equipped for the sort of depravity that they wanted to subject themselves to. Barry Wheeler made the executive decision to call off the rest of their gigs and use the money that the band had amassed through a greatest hits album and the shows they did play to establish the Valhalla Nursing Home, which opened in 2014, and
Nice going, Wheeler. Nice going.
it was a place where the Anderson brothers could live out their final days in peace. Once the Cauldron Lake threshold had again closed in 2010, Dr. Emil Hartman knew that he had to start over. He had survived his encounter with the Dark Presence, seemingly unscathed, although the lodge had been wrecked by the AWE. His lackey, Ben Mott, was not so lucky. Mott had become one of the Taken, and was disposed of by Hartman. Eyeing the destruction to his lodge, Hartman made a phone call to someone. We don't know exactly who Hartman spoke to, but he said that he was ready to reconsider their offer. He also established that whoever he was speaking to was already aware of what had happened in Bright Falls. It seems likely that Hartman was speaking to someone at the FBC. Hartman saw himself as a serious researcher and scientist, and someone who was on par with the paranatural experts at the FBC. The FBC interviewed Hartman after the Bright Falls AWE, and he tried to present himself as their peer. However, due to the nature of Hartman's experiments, the FBC charged Hartman with violating paranatural law. They detained him, confiscated all of his research, and permanently revoked his medical license.
If there's such thing as paranatural law, that means these laws are in the public, meaning the United States of America knows that there's paranatural activities happening in their country. If there's laws that have already been passed and gazetted, and it's in the public, it means that the what is it called again? The FBC and its activities are well known by the public, right? Or maybe I'm wrong about that, but why would there be laws created then? You know, how were those laws passed by the upper and lower house of the American government or legislature? So this world is not really secretive. It's in the public. People know about what's going on with these threshold portals. And, you know, I don't know how many of them are there in America or wherever else in Bright Falls or wherever else in the world. I'm not entirely sure. But it seems that supernatural, paranatural activities are normal in this society. Yeah, interesting.
With his credentials stripped, they saw Hartman as being relatively harmless, so he was soon released by the FBC. Left with almost nothing but his desire to further comprehend the mysteries of Cauldron Lake, Hartman convinced himself that he could succeed where Thomas Zane and Alan Wake had failed. He dove into the lake and was promptly overpowered by the Dark Presence. Fully possessed, Hartman was soon apprehended by the FBC and taken to their headquarters in New York City, known as the Oldest House.
What the hell, man? Oh, gosh.
The Oldest House is a paranatural phenomenon in itself, a building that is able to change its shape and appearance at will, and is essentially invisible to most of the public. It blends so neatly into the background of everything that People just don't notice it unless they are already looking for it. The oldest house is linked to a paranatural entity known as the Board. The FBC was active before discovering the oldest house, but shortly after finding it, the FBC and the oldest house became inextricably linked. The Board spoke directly to Broderick Northmore, who at the time was the director of the FBC. Northmore began to claim that all prior directors of the FBC were illegitimate, due to them not having been recognized by the Board. Northmore made contact with the Board after discovering something called the service weapon, which is a paranatural item that can take many forms. The FBC calls items like the service weapon objects of power. Retrieving the service weapon was a sort of ritual that all future directors would have to successfully perform in order to obtain the position. While not all members of the FBC agreed with this newfound relationship to the Board and the oldest house, the relationship moved forward, and in 2019, the director ritual was performed by a woman named Jessie Faden, who is the current director of the FBC.
And how long does one retain the position of director? Is it for life? Until you die, or will you, or can you be fired by the American government? Like if the government finds your actions, not, or should I say, if you bring the institution into disrepute, right? Or you don't perform well enough in your position as director, can the government say, you know what, thank you for your service, but goodbye? We're bringing someone else in, and they will have to find this gun, and they will have to become one with the Board, and therefore they'll become the director of the FBC. Yeah, I'm just wondering about that. How secure is your position as director? Are you here for life until you die, or can you be taken away by the government and someone else will come into your position?
When Hartman was apprehended by the FBC after his dive into Cauldron Lake, he was held in the investigations sector of the oldest house. At one point during his detainment, Hartman became especially worked up. This was because Alice Wake was on the premises for one of her interviews with the FBC. The connection that Hartman and Alice both shared to the Dark Place and Cauldron Lake stirred something within Hartman. He broke free from his confines and began to terrorize the investigations sector. He killed anyone he could, and overwhelmed by the monstrous thing that was once Emil Hartman, the FBC decided to close off that sector of the building entirely, trapping the monster within its walls.
You mean to tell me you guys don't have explosive weapons? Like, sealing him off doesn't solve the issue. You're just imagining him away. Out of sight, out of mind. He's still there. You need to deal with this problem. Okay.
In 2019, there was an event that was not totally dissimilar from the Bright Falls AWE. In that event, a threshold was opened in the oldest house, releasing a hostile entity known as the Hiss. The Hiss is a resonance which can quickly infect anyone or anything that it encounters, somewhat similar to the way that the Dark Presence can take over things. The person responsible for opening the threshold was former FBC director Zachariah Trench, who shot himself with the service weapon shortly after opening the threshold. Jessie Faden found his body and was compelled to pick up the weapon that was lying next to Trench. She was being pulled in by the Board to complete the initiation ritual that would make her the new director of the FBC. As director, she would be directly responsible for eradicating the Hiss from the oldest house before it could escape and affect the outside world. The Hiss was flooding the oldest house, and when it made its way to the investigations sector, What was left of Hartman was mutated and turned into an even more horrific vessel, containing elements of both the Dark Presence and the Hiss. Normally, something possessed by the Dark Presence would be able to resist such an occurrence, but the former Dr. Hartman was so far from Cauldron Lake and the source of the dark powers that it was too weak to hold out against the Hiss.
Interesting. So its area of influence and strength is also limited to Bright Falls and to the lake. The further it is away from its prime source, the weaker it becomes. And that's why I also bring into question when Thomas Zane was writing himself out of existence. What does that mean? Because people in the town still remember him. The effective range of the powers of the lake are also not infinite. It doesn't affect the entire planet. So when they say that he erased himself out of existence and he erased Barbara out of existence, what does that mean exactly?
When director Jesse Faden was working on clearing out the Hiss, she had to go to the investigation sector and battle the monster that Hartman had become. While making her way toward the monster, Faden began to see visions of Alan Wake.
My gosh. No, man, this guy needs to be put down. Look at him. Oh, gosh.
First, she saw him in her mind's eye, and later, she peered at him through a threshold. The oldest house has a link to a mysterious location called the Ocean View Motel. The motel is a place of power, similar to how Cauldron Lake is a place of power. The motel doesn't appear to remain in one physical location, and can somehow manifest itself in different places. However, there is a direct threshold to the motel in the oldest house, which is accessed through a particular ritual that involves pulling a light cord 3 times. In the motel, there is a corridor with a series of doors. Each door is a threshold to another dimension, and it appears that one of these doors, a door marked with a spiral, is a threshold to the dark place. While director Faden didn't actually enter the threshold, she did open the door and peek inside. What she saw was disturbing. At that point in time, Alan Wake had been in the dark place for nearly 10 years, and he was clearly suffering. Faden saw Alan speaking to another man who looked just like Alan Wake, a man who identified himself as Tom Zane.
I don't get it. I don't get it. Maybe oh my gosh, maybe Thomas Zane is Alan Wake from the past. No, I'm lost. I don't know. I don't know. I don't understand. Why would Thomas Zane take the form of Alan Wake? Why?
Alan was having trouble remembering where he was and what he was doing, but Zane let Alan know that they were collaborators. Suddenly, Alan remembered Tom the Poet and Tom the Diver, but Zane said that the diver was just an old role of his from a film that he had made. More details surfaced in Alan's mind, and he remembered his double, presumably Mr. Scratch. Zane assured Alan that he was going to handle that double for him, but Alan didn't trust Zane.
Alan, Zane, Scratch. 3 people, all sharing the same face, the same voice, the same body. Hey.
Faden closed the door, confused by what she had seen.
I would do the same. I've given up. I'm lost.
Thomas Zane was actually Jesse Faden's favorite poet, and although most of his work had been erased from reality, somehow Jesse was familiar with it. When she was younger, Jessie Faden quoted one of his poems to a psychiatrist that she was seeing. The psychiatrist attempted to look up the poet, but all they could find was record of a filmmaker named Thomas Zane, who moved to the United States from Europe in the 1960s. While we don't know for sure how Jessie Faden was able to read Thomas Zane's poetry, it's possible that she found a shoebox that contained some of his works.
But how? And where? Where did she obtain it? How many of these shoe boxes has Thomas Zane, had in his possession, and where did he distribute them? How is it possible that she would know, or not know, but how would she be able to obtain one of these shoe boxes when she was nowhere near the town of Bright Fall?
Jessie is from a town called Ordinary in the state of Maine. In 2002,
the state of Maine, the state of Washington. I don't know, are they close? I'll have to check on a map. Because really, I'm asking myself, how is it possible that this director was able to obtain the shoebox with manuscripts, written by Thomas Zane? How? How is that possible?
There was an AWE in Ordinary, during which a threshold opened up that released hostile entities into the small town. All of the adults in Ordinary disappeared during this AWE. FBC agents were eventually dispatched, and they attempted to round up anyone still left in the area. Jessie was only 11 years old at the time. Terrified, she ran away and was able to escape the FBC agents who had come to take her. After that, Jessie spent most of the next 17 years drifting from place to place. The FBC had entirely covered up the Ordinary AWE, and anyone who Jessie tried to confide in about her experiences saw her as delusional. Jessie Faden had a brother named Dylan, who was 1 year younger than her. Together, they found an old slide projector and a number of loose slides that had seemingly magical qualities. While the siblings didn't quite understand what they were getting into, the slide projector was an object of power, and it had the capability to open thresholds. Each slide represented another threshold and another dimension. Through the projector, Jessie and Dylan made contact with a seemingly benevolent entity, which Jessie refers to as Polaris.
Let me guess, Polaris is a... what do they call them again? A light power, right? And probably it's the same light power that calls itself Thomas Zane. And this light gave the director, the shoebox. Maybe, yeah.
Polaris bonded with the siblings, creating a sort of psychic link to each child. This bond also gave the siblings paranatural abilities. The projector also brought forward hostile entities, which were ultimately the main cause of the Ordinary AWE. When the FBC agents came to Ordinary in response to the AWE, Dylan was captured by them. He spent the next 17 years at the oldest house, being monitored and subjected to a series of experiments that attempted to gauge his paranatural potential. Jessie never forgot her brother, and although she spent many years seemingly wandering from place to place, she never stopped searching for the truth behind what happened to Dylan. It was that search, guided by Polaris, that brought her to the oldest house, and inadvertently led to her becoming the director of the same organization that had torn her family apart. Sometime after the Ordinary AWE, the FBC led a program focused on repopulating the area, and in 2012, a woman named Samantha Wells bought a house in Ordinary. It was an old house that she wanted to fix up and turn into the house of her dreams. She documented this renovation progress on a blog called This House of Dreams. According to her posts, she found a shoebox in the attic of the house that contained a series of poems, as well as some photographs of a diver and a woman, although the faces of these individuals were blocked out by some sort of ink blot. The poems were by Thomas Zane, and the photos were presumably of Zane and Barbara Jagger, taken before the 1970 Bright Falls AWE. Among these poems was one that contained the line, "Beyond the shadow you settle for, there's a miracle illuminated." That poem was not only Jesse Faden's favorite poem, but also the favorite poem of Emil Hartman. While we don't know for sure if this shoebox in the attic is something that Jesse interacted with as a child,
I'm sure she did, through the projector. Because the entity that comes out of that projector, the Polaris, yes, whatever it is, it gave that shoebox to Jesse and to her brother. And this entity, Polaris, I'm assuming it is also another version of the light presence, which is also calling itself Thomas Zane. Yes, I think they're all related. Yeah.
The potential for that to be the case is definitely there. While both Faden and Hartman had a deep appreciation for the poetry of Thomas Zane, by the time the two met, there was no chance of them discussing their mutual love for his work. Director Jesse Faden killed the monster that Hartman had become, and in doing so, closed one chapter of our story, but another chapter is now ready to be opened. In 2019, the FBC received a request for information regarding Bright Falls and the disappearance of Alan Wake. This request came from an FBI agent named Alex Casey. The fact that this agent shares a name with the protagonist of Alan Wake's most famous novels is not lost on the FBC, and it's likely that they are running surveillance on Agent Casey. The FBC honored Casey's request, but heavily redacted the documents that were sent to him.
Casey probably exists because of Alan Wake's, novels. Maybe whatever book he brought to Bright Falls, it also fell into the lake, and thus the existence of this new creature or being has come into fruition, and that's Alex Casey. Yeah, I don't know.
This investigation by Alex Casey, the involvement of the FBC, and the complex relationship between Alan Wake, Mr. Scratch, and Thomas Zane all helped to form the basis for Alan Wake 2. And with that, you should be pretty well caught up on things. Now, let's revisit some of those mysteries that we identified during this recap. The team behind Bright Falls worked hard to stay true to Remedy's canon. In episode 4, titled Local Flavor, Jake Fisher visits a general store. In the background, we can see a character dressed like Ben Mott. The character only appears briefly in the background of this scene, but thanks to some sleuthing by a dedicated Alan Wake fan, we know that this character was portrayed by James A. Smith, who also worked as the stunt coordinator on the show. IMDb lists this character from the general store scene as Ben Mott, but the show has no official credits posted anywhere else, so without further confirmation, this should be taken with a grain of salt. However, James A. Smith recently acknowledged that he also portrayed the diver on Bright Falls. This could mean that the diver from the opening scene is Ben Mott, which would make a lot of sense. In that scene, the person in the body bag that the diver deposits on the shore is Jake Fisher. That opening scene was inserted out of sequence. It was a glimpse into Jake's future in Bright Falls, which is clarified in a later episode. If Hartman saw Jake as a potentially useful resident of the Cauldron Lake Lodge, it would make sense for Hartman to send Mott out to follow Jake, just like he would do with Alan Wake. Again, without an official credits listing, this theory that Ben Mott is the diver is a little shaky.
I'm still stuck on the diver being Thomas Zane, and yeah, I'm still stuck with that. I'm not sure about this new, thought process here. I'm not entirely sure. No.
But knowing how dedicated the Bright Falls crew was to staying true to the world that Remedy was getting ready to present in Alan Wake, I wouldn't at all be surprised to find out that this theory is entirely accurate. The identity of Thomas Zane remains one of the most persistent mysteries of Alan Wake. When Alan first encounters the Anderson brothers, they call him Tom. When we see Thomas Zane in Control, he looks identical to Alan Wake. Throughout the first Alan Wake game, we never actually see Thomas Zane's face.
This is why I thought at first that, maybe this is Thomas Zane, maybe Thomas Zane is his father. If it's not his father, then it's him, but from the past. Thomas Zane and Alan Wake are the same person. However, somehow, some way, the past Alan Wake, aka Thomas Zane, exists, while in the future there's going to be another reincarnation of Alan, or aka Thomas Zane, in this new reality. Yeah, I don't know, guys. I'm confusing you. I'm confusing myself. All I know is that these two are related somehow. Either through time and space or through blood. Yeah.
Does he actually look like Alan, or is that just some mechanism of the Dark Place giving Zane that appearance?
I mean, if the old gods of Asgard, the brothers, if they can see that, or they recognize Alan Wake as Thomas Zane, there must be some sort of time-related situation there, Yeah, I don't know.
Honestly, there are no clear answers to this one. The best guess that I can give is that Thomas Zane was indeed a filmmaker at some point in his life, and he later started writing poetry in Bright Falls before disappearing into the Dark Place, but none of that accounts for Thomas Zane looking just like Alan Wake. In Control, Jesse Faden can find some confiscated audio recordings made by Emil Hartman. In one of these recordings, Hartman says that people in Bright Falls had reported seeing Thomas Zane after Alan Wake disappeared into Cauldron Lake. We don't know exactly what these people were seeing or what Zane looked like, but that's a very interesting detail that's really easy to overlook. In Alan Wake Illuminated, which is a book covering the making of Alan Wake, it says that there is a lot about Zane that didn't make its way into this first game. As much as I would love to crack the code on this mystery, I think that playing Alan Wake 2 is going to be crucial to figuring any of this out. When Alan Wake first met Ben Mott, Mott said, "Congratulations, you're going to bring about something glorious and terrible once we get you some proper editorial control." When Hartman is confronted during the blackout at the lodge, he tells Wake that they should work together to create something wonderful. In the FBC's opinion, Hartman wanted to shape reality to his own benefit. I read this all two different ways. In one sense, Hartman may have wanted to create a reality that fit his own selfish desires. However, that line from Mott about something glorious and terrible really makes me wonder if Hartman wanted to unleash the Dark Presence into reality and thought that he could somehow benefit from doing so. Hartman was definitely aware of the dark presence and knew that light could be used to battle against it, both literally and figuratively. But maybe he also thought that light could tame it in some way. With Hartman now dead, it's unlikely that we'll get any further clarification on this, but it's still a fun one to think about. Ever since players first dove into Alan Wake, there was discussion online about who made who. Did Thomas Zane create Alan Wake? Did Wake create Zane? How did Zane know about Alan's childhood? Was the story about the clicker even true? All of this stuff about the clicker and Cynthia Weaver holding on to the shoebox was confusing for players, but it was confusing for Alan Wake as well. He asked the diver about the page, to which the diver replied, "I am not the author of your story." Okay, fair enough, but the diver technically isn't Thomas Zane, it's the bright presence just using the form of Thomas Zane. So, if that's the case, it's possible that Thomas Zane did write this manuscript page, and somehow knew about Alan's life before Alan even showed up in Bright Falls. It's also possible that Zane and Wake have been longtime collaborators. This is another one of the more persistent mysteries in the Remedy-connected universe and the story of Alan Wake. At the time of making this video, I haven't yet played Alan Wake 2, but I get the impression that if we're gonna solve this particular mystery, we're gonna need to play that game first. And I also believe that Alan Wake 2 is going to present its own series of mysteries for players to get into, and I look forward to getting into them. And I thank you for getting into these ones with me. If you've stuck around this long, thank you. If you want to support the channel, you know how to do it. There's links down below. You can like, subscribe, channel memberships, Patreon, it's all there. Please share this video with anyone you think might enjoy it, and until next time, see ya!
Okay guys, that is it with Alan Wake full story and extended lore explained on the Hidden Machine YouTube channel, requested by JP Spectrum 8. Yes. Oh, okay. Yeah. I think I also need to play Alan Wake for me to understand what's going on here. Because really the lore and or should I say the full story and the extended lore is very complicated. It's very confusing, especially when you have to deal with Thomas Zane, with Alan Wake, and then the Thomas Zane bright presence version of him. These three characters are just confusing everything for me, you know, because I'm not sure whether we are dealing with time manipulation. Are we dealing with some sort of, written existence? Because you know what happens when a writer or an artist, writes about something near the cauldron, and, whatever they write comes into existence. So maybe we're dealing with something like that. Maybe we're dealing with a story within a story within a story. You know, whoever the main writer is has created the story, and it's just become another story inside another story, another universe inside another universe inside another universe. So it's confusing. It's confusing, and I don't know how are the players going to unravel this entire situation in Alan Wake 2. Maybe you need Alan Wake 3 to fully understand and to unravel everything. I think they need to make 3 games based on this storyline. But yeah, this town of Bright Falls, really, it is a strange one. What's going on here? And in terms of the dark presence, it's not really clinical in its endeavor to control the entire town or to escape from its imprisonment inside the dark place, the other dimension. It had multiple opportunities to get out, if I can say that, because it's been able to control and manipulate other living beings like animals and other human beings. And I'm sure there's other writers and other people who can, make up stories. They don't have to be poets. They don't have to be writers like Alan Wake or like Thomas Zane. It can be anyone. Anyone from a school can write a story, So, the dark presence could have manipulated one of the school children or a teacher or someone in a library and bring them to the lake and then, write out the escape of the dark presence from the dark place. Yes, the alternate dimension. So there were many other opportunities where this dark presence could really use its powers in a way that it would be beneficial to it escaping from its imprisonment. But instead, it's looking for specific people, like this poet, Thomas Zane, and like the writer, Alan Wake, who I think are related in some sort of way, whether through time and space or whether through blood related, or written into existence. I don't know who wrote who into existence first. Was it Thomas Zane, or was it Alan Wake who wrote Thomas Zane into existence? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, there's a lot of mysteries here that need to be unraveled. The FBC also, as an organization, it's really weird. It's really weird how the entire organization is based within a place of power, an object of power, the board, and how it's able to transform itself into whatever kind of building to disguise itself from the public. Like, why exactly? Why is that being done? Maybe because of the experiments and the things that they contain inside this building. They don't want it to be out in the public. But it's a very powerful place of power, this building. What it can do and how it does it. And yeah, there's a lot of characters. A lot of characters like Robert Nightingale, who we will never see again. How he was taken by the dark presence. Where was he taken to? Is he dead? I don't know about these things. All we just saw was him being taken away in the police station. So yeah, that was just odd. And then of course Clay Stewart. Is he dead or is he still alive? I thought the guy died because he was fighting against who was it again? No, was it Clay Stewart? Yes. Who was he fighting against? Carol Stuckey. The owner of the lodge. Not the lodge. I forgot. But it's a bread and breakfast type of establishment that Carol Stuckey owns. And I thought he was holding an axe and, butchering Clay Stewart. So I'm not sure, is he dead or is he alive? How is he alive? I'm not entirely sure about that stuff. Or maybe this was all in Alan Wake's head, after he was going through that traumatic situation with the dark presence trying to influence him. And yeah, and then we also have Alice Wake, the wife. What is she going to do about her husband being stuck in this place, in the dark presence, like dark place. Sorry, not the dark presence, but the dark place. Is she going to try to help him to escape, or is she just going to forget that she had a husband and that husband saved her life? I'm not entirely sure. What is she going to do? Barry Wheeler as well. It seems like he's also just decided to accept that his friend is dead instead of trying to figure out ways to help his friend escape from that place. Because I don't understand how is it that the chief and Barry Wheeler are just going to assume that Alan Wake is dead when they know that Alan Wake went to the Cauldron Lake tried to enter into the threshold portal, So how can they assume that he's dead from that situation? But anyways, and yeah, like, this is a lot of information to take in, a lot of information to digest. Hopefully I'm getting it right, guys. If I'm getting it wrong, completely wrong, you can just tell me in the comment section and try to correct me however you can. But definitely I will have to play the game to fully understand what is going on here, because this was a lot of information all at once. It does sound like an interesting and cool game, with the investigative theme to it as well. But yeah, it's a lot to take in. I'm confused. I'm confused with what Matt has been saying with some things, but yeah, it sounds like an interesting game. JP Spectrum 8, thank you very much for requesting that I should react to this video. I will be looking into this Remedy universe, type of games like Alan Wake, and yeah, maybe I will find it to be extremely fun and enjoyable to play later on. I don't know when am I going to play it, but I will try and find some space, some time, and get into it as well. Yeah, interesting. Okay guys, that is it for today. Remember, if you want to check out the original video as well as Hidden Machine YouTube channel, the links are going to be in the description below. If you like my reaction, please give me a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Click on the notification bell if you want to be up to date with my latest videos, and I'll see you guys next time. Okay, bye bye.